This is Dr. Churchill again, and this is Astronomy 308 into the Final Frontier. And as you know, we have broken this class up into three modules. The first is the sea race and the history of exploration of the planet and the outcomes of that for the modern world. Second, followed by the space race, which is coming up shortly because today's lecture is the end of the sea race module. And in that area, we're going to talk about the development of rockets, the role of science fiction in promoting the building of rockets and the dreams that people wanted to use rockets for getting humans into space. And we'll talk a little bit about the Cold War and how that set up the space race and eventually culminating with Apollo 11 landing on the moon. As we then move into the space shuttle era and the International Space Station era, we'll also talk about the development of some of the other countries, such as India and China and Japan, and the United Arab Emirates that are making their way into space. And let's not forget Israel as well. Then we'll do the third module, which is going to be basically the future from this point forward of space, commercialization of space, discovery and science in space, human presence and expansion and settlement of space. But today we're going to end with the outcome of the sea race. Now, the situation with today's lecture is that we are going to basically start with the beginnings of World War I and then come up to the modern day, because in a sense, the sea race happened, colonization happened, imperialism happened, and then the world thought it was doing well, that it was becoming civilized and moving forward, and there was a significant optimism, at least for the nations that had power and were in control. And then they went crazy, and we had World War I, and there was this violent disruption of the earth and humanity. Well, that set up another violent disruption of World War II. And so you can't talk about today's world without talking about those two horrendous global events that really changed things on short, sort of 5-year timescales. Then we're going to be talking about sort of the distribution of wealth and religions and languages and human right violations and things like that around the planet, geographically mostly. And what's the point? As we're going through it, I want you to imagine we've moved 500 years into the future. And when I talk about what's happening in the United States versus what's happening in China or what's happening in the Mid East or in Europe or in Russia, maybe you could think of these as being different planets in the solar system. Like, one of these countries is Mars, and one of these countries is the space surrounding Jupiter and Jupiter's moons, and the other could be the asteroid belt. Maybe one of them is, Venus. And the point being is that as we spread out into the solar system, are we going to claim these territories? And are we going to have areas that are suppressed and have certain types of laws where there's lots of freedom, lots of personal expression, individualism? Or are we going to have certain planets where there's going to be a lot of human right violations, maybe hopefully not crimes against humanity violations, but nonetheless that kind of thing. And the people that say are on Mars might have strong feelings about what the people on Venus are doing. And, we just take our problems out into the solar system. Or are we going to be like Star Trek and come to some sense of unity and federation and work together and see ourselves as whole? So that is the theme that I want you to keep in your mind as we go through today's lectures. So I'm going to share my slides. Today's lecture is called Outcomes of the Sea Race. We're going to jump ahead to the present day world from the ends of the sea race. Okay, so we're going to consider the current state of the human condition. And what I mean that is, we're going to look at the outcomes of the consequences of colonialism, the current day power distribution around the globe, the average of modern conditions geographically around the globe related to what happened in the sea race. Now, I'm encompassing the sea race as being not just what happened between Spain and Portugal, but then everything that followed, the colonization, the imperialism, the state-sponsored corporations, such as the VOC that we talked about, the Dutch VOC. Then we're going to talk about also the distribution of wealth and productivity. We'll look at the distribution of religions based upon those that have spread and those that have been confined. Languages, transportation and trade routes, which has obviously been a key part of what's created the modern world. Communication networks and hubs. And then we'll talk about those things that are the higher levels of what we call our humanity, you know, freedom, a sense of freedom, okay? Freedom of the press, for example, is a very good indicator of how free a society is, okay? Human rights, particularly modern slavery, and also the rights of women, for example, which is another great indication for how liberally minded a society is, how much it's evolved in its humanity. We'll also take a quick gander at military sizes and spending, and I think that will be illuminating, and then foreign aid and investment, sort of the altruistic aspect of nation states. Okay. Briefly, I want to remind you that as we ended the 1800s, we are in a stage where in the 1800s there was basically a colonialization grab of the continent of Africa. And we mentioned a little bit about France and its struggles against England and, you know, the English and their struggles against the Dutch, and then the decline of Spain and Portugal. And they're influenced based upon effectively naval strength. When it really came down to it, naval strength was a huge part of all of that. But if we just look at North America here in 1900, it's basically you have the United States and then you have Canada. In Africa, you see this large area that was occupied by France. It's remained occupied by France all the way up until about World War II. And you see that the sun never sets on the British Empire, which is all of this light pink here, you know. And then interestingly, something that didn't get talked about was that Iceland and Greenland were really satellites of Denmark for quite a long time. And Iceland now is, in a sense, its own sovereign nation. Okay. And then we see that the Netherlands, still in the 1900s, had some influence out here in the Spice Islands. The Dutch had that influence out in the Spice Islands. And then we see some colonization in Africa from Germany, that's the green, and also out here in the Indonesia area. Okay. I want you to note the French colony Vietnam, which became a hot spot in the 1960s. They also own Madagascar. I wouldn't say own, but. Now, let's just briefly talk about those two world wars. I've got a few slides on that. These were major global conflicts. This is a complete upheaval of the buildup of the distribution of power that happened. And the power is in the hands of very few people. You know, a Kaiser in Germany, you had the Tsar in Russia, and in Austria, you had the Habsburg family. And these were huge empires basically ruled by monarchy families, okay? So in World War I, the three people that are really in charge of the power structure of Europe are the Habsburgs in Austria, the Kaiser in Germany, and the Pasha in the Ottoman Empire. We'll talk a little bit about those Ottomans. They really were around for a long time, right there in Turkey and in the Middle East. And you're going to see that World War I is going to be the end of that empire. In Russia, you had the Tsar, Nicholas, but he didn't make it through all the way through World War I. There was a uprising, a communist uprising, the Bolshevik Revolution, which happened in 1917, at which point Russia exited the war. And then in France and England and in the United States, you have the powers there that aligned. And you can see that I've put the alignment of these various countries and empires in red and then in green. The aftermath of World War I was that there was a significant power vacuum in the Middle East. And that's when the West came in and was able to carve up the borders and basically put their mark of political and geopolitical power imprint on the area. A lot of that was based upon, of course, the petroleum fields that existed in those areas. Now, between 1918 and 1939, there was a large buildup of tension in Northern Europe. And a lot of that came about because Germany had been so well beaten by World War I, yet relatively untouched. The nation really was left intact. And whereas France was utterly destroyed, as half of it was destroyed as a wasteland. And France in particular really wanted to punish Germany. The bottom line is there were some serious harsh terms in the Treaty of Versailles from World War I. And Germany kind of revolted against this. And you had the stock market crash in the United States that then caused a lot of poverty and inflation in Germany and the European nations. This allowed Hitler to take power, and he did so first by trying to take power by force with a march on the capital of Bavaria. That failed, and he was put in prison, where he wrote a book saying, "I'm still going to take over, and I'm going to take over the world." And then he got out of prison, and he proceeded to do exactly what he'd put in his book. Mussolini was a fascist leader who had taken control in Italy, and then in Japan you had a military, you had an emperor, but then you had the military was really in charge of the government run by a man named Chojo. In Russia, by this time, you had Stalin, and then the Soviet Union, you had Stalin, and then in the United States, President Roosevelt, and in Britain, you had Winston Churchill. The aftermath of World War II was the creation of two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. And the United States put together something called the Marshall Plan, where they built the infrastructure of Western Europe up as much as they could. Why? Because the Soviet Union did not withdraw from Eastern Europe. The Allies had come from the West and the Soviets had come from the East, and they split Europe in two. The Soviets did not withdraw, and they set up puppet governments and their control there. And there literally was, as Winston Churchill called it, an iron curtain along Europe separating East and West. And so the Marshall Plan was an infusion of support to rebuild Western Europe, to get it strong, to get it back on its feet. And this allowed the United States to become a superpower, both in economic strength and in military strength that happened after World War II. And then the Soviet Unions were also a power to be reckoned with. There was also a tremendous Holocaust of Jews that happened that really shocked the world. And then, of course, nuclear bombs had been created by the United States, two of them being unleashed on Japan. And this was the first and only time that nuclear bombs have been used in war. But another thing that happened was the development of rockets in Germany. And so rockets were used against England by the Germans at the end of the war. Those rockets were capable of reaching space or going from one continent to another. And you had basically the biggest scare that's ever happened on this planet in terms of breakthrough technologies, which is the rocket and the nuclear bomb. And so now what we want to do, we want to put a nuclear bomb on the top of a rocket, send it halfway around the world in 30 minutes and destroy a city with literally no warning. very little warning, if any. We're talking 30 minutes. And in those days, there wasn't early distant warning system. So we're talking, as soon as somebody actually realized a rocket was coming toward their city. And then the other thing was that it would wipe out the city, for which there was absolutely no defense against this mechanism. And so there was a proliferation of rockets with nuclear bombs on them. These rockets were called intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. Out of this came the space race. It was an attempt by President Kennedy to take this rocket race out of the nuclear arms race and make it a civilian type of show of power to the world, for a reason which we'll get into later, which is really an important key to why we went to the moon. So this is just showing you two maps before and after World War I, Europe before that. This is the Austrian-Hungarian Empire aligned with Italy and then Germany. It's called the Triple Alliance. And then you had England and France and Russia aligned against them. And it turns out France even had a secret peace treaty with Italy. And then you have what's called the Russian allies, which was Serbia. Okay, in the end, it's very simple. A Serbian murdered the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and then Austria attacked Serbia. So Russia attacked Austria. Germany thought this was a wonderful thing. It attacked France and it attacked Russia. Okay, and it broke out real quick. Okay, and then finally England joined in, and then finally the United States joined in. Poland, after the war, was created as a buffer zone between Germany and Russia. And you'll see that Germany was split in two. You have Germany proper here, and you have Prussia, this was all part of Germany, and this was called East Prussia at the time. The country of Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary were also put together, and then the Balkans were divided up into Yugoslavia and Romania. Serbia was erased from the map, and you'll note that that's not the case anymore because those people wanted their country back, and there was some wars that included some genocide, and they got their country back. So that's history that happened in the last 20 years. So Poland was created, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia created, Serbia eliminated. The Ottoman Empire, as we'll find out, which is not on these maps, was taken out. And then the colonial powers were set up as puppet governments in various places around the Mideast and Africa. So here is the Ottoman Empire in 1914. You can see they are occupying Turkey and coming down here along Arabia, and of course what is modern day Syria and modern day Israel was all occupied. And they then came down into what is now modern day Iraq. Okay. After World War II, so we're going to basically move to 1922 for this map, you can see that there's French influence and there's British influence surrounding Arabia here all throughout the Mideast, and the Ottoman Empire is gone. I'd like to also note that we did have a lot of British influence in Egypt at that point in time as well, before the war started. Okay, if you look at the Ottoman Empire reigned from 1299 to 1918. That is a spectacular run, if there ever was one. Okay. Today's Middle East looks something more like this, and you can see that some of these lines that were drawn in the sand quite literally have become Syria and Iraq, and then we have Jordan and Beirut here, and then you have Israel in Jerusalem, and then Egypt has taken control of the Sinai Peninsula here. It has complete control of the Suez Canal, which is something that occurred in another hotspot battle in the 50s. Okay, so you can see now that this division of territory here was really a direct outcome of the Western powers carving up the Arabic nations, or basically the Ottoman Empire. Now, World War II, on the left, we see the map, which is left over from World War I. And you can see after World War II, or I'd say the present day, that the countries are split up much, much more smaller. And you can see, for example, that Serbia has come back. And along here, Yugoslavia has been replaced with Croatia and Bosnia and Albania, a lot of small little nations that they really ethnically insisted on having their own sovereignty. Now, what is the dichotomy and the very interest of all of this smaller nations being built up is that at the same time, they've unified economically into the European Union. So the interesting thing about the development of the European Union is that's a unification, economic unification of Europe, which is juxtaposed with the fragmentation of Europe in the form of nation states. At this point in time, Europe is more fragmented in terms of autonomous nation states than it has ever been in its entire history. And yet the European notion of putting together themselves as an economic force is a lesson they've learned well through history, starting all the way back with the development of trade routes from the era of the Vikings. The other thing that came out of World War II was the United Nations. And the United Nations was a way of trying to get the world to police itself, in a sense, and to settle disputes in a somewhat democratic format using diplomacy. And it was built as a check against the future building of empires and the future development of systematic genocide or crimes against humanity. The jury is out to see how well we remain committed to enforcing those ideals that came out of World War II and were felt quite strongly in the middle part of the 20th century from 1945 onward. So now we're going to look at the distribution of power and how it's distributed today. And so we see ranked here, number one is the United States. And the United States is actually considered to be the only remaining superpower currently. Post-World War II, there were two superpowers, as I mentioned, the Soviet Union at the time and the United States. And by superpower, we're going to say that this is a nation state that has enough economic and industrial and military might that it can actually influence the ability of all the other countries on the planet. Coming in number two is Russia. Coming in number three is China. It's been on a fast upward slope. But then you can see that 4, 5, and 6 are occupied by Europe. And this is going to be a theme that we're going to see with all of these maps, is that Europe is very wealthy, very rich, has great infrastructure. And this is all going to be at the expense of the period of imperialism and colonization around the planet. Now, I'm having you watch a couple movies by John Green, one before the World War I and World War II movies, and that one is going to talk about the spread of colonialism, and then you'll see what happened to the world in World War I and World War II, and then the last video is the decolonization, which is post-World War II. So this is a movie that starts to talk about history that is during my childhood. And this is the splitting out or the loss of power of these nation states and the implications as to why the world is distributed, the resources of the world are distributed the way they are. And that's what I'm showing you in this lecture are the maps that show you that distribution. But I want you to watch those movies so you can watch that story unfold in much more detail than I can give you here. All right. I'd just like to mention that Japan has been doing quite well economically. After World War II, they emulated the methods of the Western nations, and they've adopted those and embraced those, and it's turned out quite well for them. And then we see here that Saudi Arabia has quite a bit of influence and power, particularly in its region. A lot of this is because it has a great deal of wealth. So I'd like you to understand that you live in probably the best time to live on the planet that has ever existed. And I know that must be hard to believe, because you might look at your future and think that things are going to, get tougher than they are currently. And there's pretty good reason to believe that. We're, as I said, on a train that's heading down some tracks at high speed, and we have to basically get control of that train, slow it down, and maybe put it on a different set of tracks in order to make sure that we can have a self-sustaining planet with this huge human population pressure that is on it. But if you just go back 100 years to 1820, okay, let's look at some of these indicators: poverty, education, literacy, democracy, vaccination, and child mortality. So this is a chart that basically says, out of every 100 people, this is how many people would live under these conditions. It's basically a percentage. So I'm going to talk about it in terms of percentage. So, for example, in 1820, you would say that only 6% of the people on the planet were not living in extreme poverty. I don't know the exact definition of extreme poverty on this graph, but let's just take a look at this dramatic trend here, is that by the time you get to today, only 10% of the planet is living in what we would call extreme impoverished conditions. If you look at basic education, about 17% of the people on the planet had a basic education, which I don't know the definition again, but I'll assume it's sort of high school level, for example. Maybe sixth grade, maybe it's a very simple level, but the bottom line is that when you use this indicator, we go from 17% in 1820 up to 86% today. So I would imagine this is at least some kind of high school or mid-high school equivalency. What about the ability to read? 12% of the human population was educated enough to read in the 1820s, and yet today it's up to 85%. So another vast improvement. This is really important because reading is a way of disseminating information, whether it's lies and conspiracy or whether it's truth. Democracy would be an indication of, say, the level of freedom, perhaps, that people have a voice in their governance, their self-governance, and 1% in 1820 and 56% today. You can see there was this vast dip here that really came about on account of World War II and the building up of these imperialistic forces in Japan, spreading across the South Pacific and into China. And then you had Germany, which spread across Europe and into Africa. Interestingly, we had this thawing of the Cold War in 1989, and you can start to see then this development in the increase of these democracies. And so you have a lot of nations, particularly in Western Europe, that as that Iron Curtain melted that was across Europe, the nations that were occupied by the Soviet Union and effectively were communist states have then liberated themselves and set up their own governments. Vaccination is something that really didn't exist until the 1960s, which is interesting because, I was born basically right here. And I remember getting penicillin shots all the time as a child, but I had no idea that that wasn't something that had always existed forever. It just started, but basically when I was born. So no vaccinations back in 1820. So if you got smallpox or measles, that was it for you. Basically, you'd be very lucky to survive. But now we have vaccinations up to 86% of the world vaccinated against some of these main diseases. So that also is another, great thing for the betterment of the human condition on the planet. Child mortality, of course, is a great indicator. This one, I do know the definition of. This means, if you were to die before the age of 5, And so in 1820, 100, I've been saying it's 100 years ago. Well, I'm glad you're listening so well that you realize I was wrong, that it's 200 years ago. Sorry about that. 200 years ago, that would be the case for all the graphs, then you would see that 43% of the people that were born died before the age of 5 in the 1820s, 200 years ago. It hadn't really improved that much by the 1920s, which is 100 years ago. There we go. I got my 100 years ago in there. And then it's just steadily declined over the 20th century. And today, somewhere on the order of 4% of the human population is dying before the age of 5. So you can see that we really live in a much better world than people did 100 or 200 years ago using these indicators. So let's look at gross domestic product. And this is basically a measure of the market value of all the goods that you can put out on the market, okay? Green is high, which means you're highly industrial and you're able to produce a lot of these goods and services. And pink, deep pink or red-ish is that you have a low GDP. So here we have, again, the United States, and it's one of the highest producers, Australia, and you see that Scandinavia is also a high GDP producer, and a few spots in Europe. But again, where are all the green areas? The ex-British occupied territories of Canada. This was an ex-British occupied territory, but we revolted early in the game. And so we didn't get exploited a great deal. We revolted because we were getting exploited. But so what I want to show you here again is this pattern of green that is centered on Europe, a little bit on Saudi Arabia, and then you'll see here that Japan has done very well for itself. And you can see this marking between South Korea and North Korea, because South Korea has also embraced a free market system and really become highly productive. And you can see Hong Kong here, and then you can see Singapore. These are small cities that have separated themselves out from the country that surrounds them. They're their own autonomous city-state in a sense. So bottom line is we're going to see this pattern throughout, where Europe is, a high producer, is wealthy, et cetera, and the United States is following suit with Australia. And a lot of these countries, especially if you look at Africa, is very, very low production. And when you watch John Green's video on decolonization, you'll realize that some of these countries are literally less old than I am. So they're just getting started because they've really been suppressed and controlled for a couple centuries, or at least a century. So when we look at income level, blue is good here, and then brownish is the worst. And you can see basically the distribution of population on the planet here. And then where do you see the highest level of wealth? Europe and the United States, South Korea and Japan, and Australia. It's a theme that occurs again and again. And then, of course, in Saudi Arabia, you see the patches where the population centers are, that they also have quite a bit of wealth. As you go into Portugal and South America, you're getting into sort of the upper middle regions of wealth. And here in Turkey, and then where the Byzantine Empire used to be, but is now the remnants of the East Bloc from the Soviets, that has beginning to get on its feet since the 1990s, and they're developing quite well at this point in time, but you still see a lot of red areas here. And then Africa, of course, is dismally low in its income level. So when you look at those poverty charts, you can tell where most of the poverty really is. It's actually in these nations here, and then, of course, in India and here in China. What about religion? Well, we all know that religion got spread about the world by those who went out and engaged in sea exploration. But really, after the sea exploration, then took over with colonization and imperialism, and in that process spread their religions. So we've got these sort of three main groups here: Judaism, which is being Catholic or Protestant Christian or Orthodox Christian. And then Islam, which is broken into two, the Sunnis and the Shia. We have Buddhism and Hinduism, and this is sort of the Eastern religions. And then, some of these non-traditional religions that we talk about, or basically atheism, which is, agnostic to religion at the very least. So you can see that purple and blue have really spread a great deal. The Catholicism spread clearly because if you remember, before Spain entered the sea race with Portugal, it was controlled by Ferdinand and Isabella, and they were zealous Catholics. In fact, remember, they were expunging all the Muslims and all the Jews and Christians out of Spain. And then when they spread and to the Americas, they brought Catholicism. And so it really took root in South America, Central America, and here you can see in the southern part of the western part of the United States. It also seems to, from France's influence up here in the Quebec area, has taken a hold up here in eastern Canada. And you can see that there are some areas where the Portuguese had been, where it infiltrated, and then there are some areas that it's made its way into Australia. It's very strong in these islands here that have come under the American and the Spanish influence. If you remember right before the Treaty of Zaragoza, this became a Spanish colony. Now, Protestants, which mostly came from England, because it rejected Catholicism in the 1500s, and then brought that over first with the Pilgrims and then to Jamestown, and then it spread across the colonies. And so the Protestant form of religion, Christianity, has spread quite a bit throughout the world. It also has made its way up into the Scandinavian countries, and of course a lot here throughout Africa. And then the Sunnism and the Shiaism is very interesting. We all know that the Muslims had a lot of control all the way from Eastern China up through here, and then you had the Ottoman Empire coming down through here, and then of course we know that some of the imperial aspirations of the Muslim world moved up into the Iberian Peninsula and were across Africa. And so you can see that Islam is spread out in these areas still today. And then some of the Islamic religion here, the Sunni religion, exists in the Malaysian area. And this really has a lot to do with the voyages of Chang Ho or Zhang He, depending on which name you wish to give to the admiral. And then we have the Shia Islam, and this was a separate sect of the Muslim religion that separated out. There was basically a contention as to who was going to carry the torch, if you will, from Muhammad forward in the Muslim religion. And so there was a split, and you can see that the Shia are limited mostly to the Iranian area, and also this is the borders of Iraq here, and you can see them here in southern Iraq. So they are much more concentrated. Hinduism is almost exclusively confined to India. And then you see that Buddhism is basically spread out through the Southeast Asia, through Japan, a little bit in China, and up here in the areas of just westward of Mongolia. So how are languages distributed? This shouldn't be too surprising to you. Let's start with the English. So obviously English across the United States and Canada. It turns out that there's a lot of French speaking up here as well. And then you can see that England had a lot of control of India. There'll be some talk about that in the movies from John Green. And that they had control of Australia and the colonies over here that used to be owned by Spain and in New Zealand. And then you see that there was some battles over who was going to control South Africa, and the English language has migrated its way up through here. French, on the other hand, believe it or not, is also spoken around the world a great deal, particularly in Africa as a result of French colonization during the great African land grab of the European powers. And so these areas here are still quite prevalent in French speaking. The Arabic nations, of course, there's multiple Arabic languages, but they are mostly spoken along this area of Africa and along the peninsula here of Arabia. And of course, Spanish spread to the Americas through Spain's colonizations across Central America and South America. And you can see that you know, apart from this stretching out of the influence of the Portuguese language, that you almost see the line that the Pope drew down the globe in 1497 in the Treaty of Tordesillas that is responsible for the split between half this continent speaking Spanish and the other half speaking Portuguese. So it's one person's decision back in 1497 set up this distribution. All right. So we have some other minor languages, but I'd like to note that German is quite isolated to Germany. Even though they had some colonies down here, it turns out that they did not have control over those colonies long enough for the language to really infiltrate into the local peoples. So again, religion, language, GDP, income, they're all related to the distribution of what happened following the sea race and the subsequent outcomes of that through colonialism and imperialism. Global transportation, need I say more? There you see Europe is so dense with air network that, you know, it wipes out the map itself, and the eastern seaboard of the United States and North America. You can see here Rio de Janeiro is also quite a hub, and don't forget that this is where a lot of the sugar cane was, that the VOC, the Dutch VOC, had a lot of slave labor come across here, and so this was a major hub. Clearly, we have a major hub down here at the Cape of Good Hope from in South Africa, and then we have some of the sea routes in the blue that were left over from the monsoon marketplace, and these sea routes have been in place, as you know now, for 2,000 years. Roads, well, interestingly, you can see where desert is and where rainforest is and where more desert and mountains are, so that the roads aren't there. But the humans have basically built this infrastructure of roads basically everywhere. The thing that I want to mention here that you can't really see on this map is that in World War II, in preparation for World War II, Hitler had built the Autobahn, which were major highways, if you will, what we consider to be our interstate freeways. He built those across Germany so that he could transport large military shipments and mobilize troops back and forth across the nation very quickly and efficiently. Now, Eisenhower, who was the general in command of the Allied forces when he got to Germany after they conquered Germans in World War II, saw the Autobahn and realized this is a fantastic system for networking a country. And so when he became president in the 1950s of the United States, he decided to build the freeway system, the interstate system. So that started only about 70 years ago that started to be built. And the good, the bad, and the ugly of it, whatever it may be, but that system has really networked this nation together in a way that was visualized by learning the lessons from what Hitler did to unify Germany. How is internet connectivity distributed today? Okay, so the internet, again, is something that is relatively new. So this is something I want you to understand about this. Here we're taking something that's relatively new. It develops And it's only developed in the last 30 years, okay? In the 1990s, it was just barely getting off the ground. We were just starting to have email that was, public. Yahoo, that company, had just started for the, as a startup company. And now, 30 years later, from something that is built up in an infrastructure that's the remnant of this history that we've been talking about, look what we see. Europe has the infrastructure. They have the resources, they have the money, they have, the education, all of these things that are required in order to build something like this internet. So the connectivity here is dramatic. Again, same thing with the Eastern Seaboard down here in Rio de Janeiro. Of course, there's some hot spots in these areas that are along trade routes today or shipping routes. Japan, South Korea, as you can see, Australia, the main cities. And then even in Scandinavia, you can see that in some of their main areas where their population density is high, that you have this internet connectivity. This is a perfect example of that. When new things come into being, there's total inequity because of the history of the exploitation of the nations that started the sea race. Now, I find this fascinating because that tells you something about how the future might unfold as well. That again, it's going to take centuries for some sense of equity to occur or equality to occur in any of these indicators that we're talking about. Now, you may know that Elon Musk, the founder of SpaceX, is putting up his Starlink satellites. And his idea is to cover the globe with a network of satellites that are going to provide internet to every spot on the planet. It doesn't matter where you are. You could be on the North Pole, in the center of the Sahara Desert. You will be as linked up as somebody here would be, say, in Paris or in New York City. And that is a great equalizer, if you will. It's not that everybody can afford that or has the infrastructure to connect to it, but the point is that that infrastructure is going to be built and it will be equally available to all peoples. And these are the steps needed to be taken. Things like this, where we can start to equalize opportunity for everybody on the planet and start to take these maps and distribute them more evenly. The space capsule payload contains a Starlink satellite. Okay, let's look at freedom of the press. So now, in a sense, we're going to talk about the ideas that have happened. How much say do people have in their own government? How much freedom do they have to express their thoughts and ideas? In this diagram, white is the best and black is the worst. So again, you can see the same patterns showing up again. Okay, United States, Canada, Spain, France, and Europe, England here, okay, all doing very, very well. Australia, South Africa, South Korea, okay, Taiwan, which is a sort of a rebel state from China. And then where do you see the worst happening? Let's look at the red at first, okay. We have some of these remnant areas from the Spanish colonization. And part of that problem is that you have, in some places, you have corruption of the government or centralized government that has a lot of control. In South America, for example, the reason it's orange and red is because there were a lot of military coups, and the military would take over. They would then control the press and filter everything out from there. The same thing in Africa. A lot of military coups with time. And once the European powers pulled out, then you had these nations that had been shown Western style government, but didn't have the history and knowledge and perspective to develop those governments and then run those governments. And so they turned out to be quite weak and susceptible to military takeover. And so you got a lot of that going on. And this is, again, the quality of freedom here is a result of the period of colonization. It's interesting that because the colonies, the American colonies, rebelled against England and then became self-sovereign, is one of the reasons that the United States was able to forge its own direction. Those people that had founded the United States had that background. They had the education, they had the experience of those governments. And so they wanted, in fact, to embrace them, and they had the ability to administer them because of the experience that was, lodged in their culture and their knowledge base. If we look at the very serious situations here, we have China. China has complete and total state control of the press. Okay, same thing with Iran here, and Saudi Arabia and Yemen. These are very, very highly controlled nations, and in fact, there's a large religious component to the government. There's not a separation of church and state in that sense. So the church is really quite in control. And we saw that happen with the Roman Catholic Church for a while, when it had a lot of control over Europe and suppressed many ideas. That's why Galileo was under house arrest for saying that the world was rotated and things like this. Again, you get the very strong picture here that, in fact, this distribution is the remnant of this history that we've been talking about. Now, another indication of sort of sensibility of humanity, the idea of freedom, that people should have the ability to make free choices and have individualism and self-expression, is totally related to the gender identity and sexual orientation. And so this is another map which is showing you the areas where the state, in other words, the governments of these nations, either does not allow this discussion or will penalize if you are homosexual or wish to change your gender or discuss your gender identity as being other than, say, a biological appearance, if you will, and nations that are open to this. So blue on this diagram is good, and red on this diagram, particularly deep dark red, is very bad. So deep dark red, if you raise your hand and I'm a homosexual, then they will basically execute you. So this is not something that you can talk about freely, and if you engage in homosexuality, then and you get caught, you will be killed. In these 78 countries, it's illegal, but it may not include a capital punishment. And see that this is, again, in nations that are where the target, these are nations that were the target of imperialism. Light blue states, you could say that it's legal, okay, but it doesn't mean that socially you're free to do what you want to do, okay? There's no legal ramifications. And it's not even clear in some of those nations whether same-sex marriages are allowed, or there's probably a spectrum for the light blue states. Interestingly, the African region, which was colonized by France, seems to be more advanced in this regard. And then 65 of these nations where it's protected, including the United States, Brazil, and Mexico, some of the regions of South America here. And then, of course, South Africa, which is interesting since there's a long history of something called apartheid in South Africa, where you had racism that was off the chart, that lasted all the way until this millennium. Now, I just want to mention that Britain itself, the thing that's interesting is most of these nations, not all of them, but most of these nations are related to ex-British Empire areas that built themselves up from their British, I don't want to say invasion, but their British colonization, that basically they continued to carry the torch of Britain locally. Like, the United States kind of carried the torch of Britain, even though it rebelled against Britain. Same thing happened in South Africa and Australia. And it's kind of interesting that those areas are the ones that fit within the 65 protected nations. But interestingly, as it was only in 1967 that England passed what's called the Sexual Offense Act. And this, before that point in time, you would be actually incarcerated if you were homosexual. And if you were released from prison, then you had to go through treatments. You were like on parole and you had to take drugs and seek psychological treatment on a regular basis. It was only in 67 that they removed those laws. And again, I was 5 years old when that happened. So this is really relatively recent. Again, the degree to which they protect this is consensual if you are in private and you are adults over 21 years of age or over. So I really don't know what that means for people that are under 21 in Britain. But as you can see, free press and sexual orientation, freedom of sexual orientation, have some correlation with each other, as well as the imperialism and influence of some of the Western powers. Equality of gender, another great indicator for how advanced and open-minded a civilization or culture has become. Again, on this diagram, red is bad and green is good. So dark green is the best. And so you can see that, again, the same pattern where Europe is green, and then you see some yellow in the United States. So we're not really doing the best, but South Africa is doing quite well. And we see here that Chile's doing quite well, and New Zealand's doing quite well, and the Scandinavian countries are doing quite well. Now, interestingly, Spain's doing well. What does green really mean? It means 40% or more of your government is comprised of the female gender or women. If you are red, then somewhere between 0 and 10% of your government is populated by women. And so you can see that this is very true in some of these nations in the Mideast, and then in Brazil, and then in some of these areas in Indonesia. And interestingly, Southeast Asia here, even though economically these countries are doing really, really well, then they haven't necessarily opened up to the idea of equality between men and women. What about property rights? Green is good, no discrimination. Yellow is some discrimination. Red is significant discrimination. Again, you see the same map pattern. Again, I'm just going to stop saying everything over and over and over again because they all look the same. The trafficking in women. So this is horrific. This is basically slavery, modern day slavery. And you can see that there are some red zones on the planet here in the Mideast, over here in the Indonesian area, and left over in Africa. The best areas, turned out Poland is one of the best areas on the planet. And this light green is that trafficking is illegal, but there are enforcement lapses. So even in the United States here, where we consider ourselves rightly or wrongly, we tend to have a pretty elevated view of ourselves as being highly civilized, that there are lapses in our enforcement of trafficking of women. And then yellow, it's illegal, but it's not really enforced in its practice. So this is a horrible map to discuss. And then here is the legality of rape. So basically in these red states, the deep red states, which basically are a 10 on this 1 to 10 scale here, there are not consequences if you rape women. In fact, there are sometimes some unspoken cultural rules that promote it or allow it. I don't want to get into the details of discussing that because it's well above my head. I'm an astronomer and I don't want to speculate on some of the horrificness that goes on in parts of the planet. But as you can see, The United States is here around the 2 to 3 zone, doing fairly well. It's really looked down upon in our society. There are laws against it, and they are fairly well enforced. But as you know, there are cultural difficulties if you are the victim of rape in dealing with other stigmas that can come along with that. So we have a long way to go when it comes to the culture of rape. Again, you see a map which green is again in the same spots as it always is, and it's an artifact of the period of outcomes of the sea race again. Believe it or not, slavery is still alive and well on the planet. Here we have another diagram. Red is bad and green, dark green is very good. And so you see the best places to be on the planet if you don't want to be a slave is Iceland and New Zealand. And other than that, you see that Scandinavia is doing very well. Canada, great. Again, this interesting area here that we've seen come up again and again, where the western side of South America is doing better than the eastern side. I guess I want to just mention that there are 5 million or more slaves in India, for example. So where you have extreme poverty, we talked about, you're going to have situations where you're going to have indentured servitude, which effectively is slavery. Okay, we are getting close to the end here, and I just wanted to briefly talk about military investment. So who spends the most money on their military? And this is kind of a segue slide because this is telling you something about what the future might look like in terms of who has power and control because they're willing to invest. So the largest military is obviously, as we see on the left here, China with 2.1 million, followed by India. They also have a huge population from which to draw, followed by the United States at 1.2 million. And then coming down is a very small nation, North Korea, where effectively everyone's at some point conscripted into the military. Russia at 1 million, and then moving on downward. Now, as far as spending money on the military, what I'd like you to think of this pie as all of the military spending by all of the nations in the world. Okay, that's 100%. Of all the military spending of all the nations in the world, the United States spends 45% of that amount of money on the military. Okay, so alone, our own nation almost spends half the world's money on its own military. The next top 14 nations, starting with China, moving on down this list, is 40%. So all of these nations together almost spend as much money on their military as the United States does, and then the rest of the world, put them all in this bucket at about 15%. One of the reasons of the US building such a large military is we embraced the idea of taking strategic responsibility for the stability of Europe after World War II, and then we expanded that notion, okay, into Asia and into the Middle East. Okay, as you know, we've waged several wars on behalf of what we would call strategic responsibility. And I use the word strategic loosely, and I use the word responsibility loosely. Okay, it really was a good endeavor at post-World War II because we had something called the Marshall Plan. And basically, we filtered millions of dollars into Western Europe in order to rebuild it after World War II because it was very weakened. And we were very worried because the Soviet Union had plowed into the eastern half of Europe and did not retract afterwards. It stayed there and set up puppet communist countries. And it had its aspirations on spreading across Western Europe. And we wanted to stem that tide. And the one way we did it was we spent a great deal of money and set up military bases and missile silos that surrounded the Eastern Iron Curtain. And so there was a great deal of money. And we've basically taken that philosophy and expanded it around the globe. That's why we had the Vietnam War, for example. Okay, I would say that China and Russia haven't embraced similar goals in the same way that the United States has. What about foreign aid? Because this is the other side of the coin. You know, we talked about strategic responsibility from a militaristic standpoint and protection and the building of infrastructure or protection so that that can happen. But this is the foreign aid. And you can see that the United States tops this list considerably, followed by, believe it or not, Germany, and then the UK, the United Kingdom, England, and then France, Japan. You don't see China and Russia on here, so they're not really interested in foreign aid. And foreign aid is money that is meant to build the country up for the sake of that country. Now, let's just face it, that's not always completely altruistic, which is to say there are alternative interests in giving certain nation states money so that they can, you know, take care of their population and build infrastructure. But that money is given to the country, and then there's expectations for what they're going to do with it. That money is not directly invested by the United States into the country. The money is given to the leaders of that country who then invest in that country. That's different. Now, China and Russia have been investing in Africa, for example, over the last 20 years dramatically. And in fact, I have a little statement down here. China's investment in Africa has increased by 780% since 2003. And that is to say that they are investing in the infrastructure of African countries and nations. And the idea is they want to have influence and set up direct, you know, relationships in an economic and political sense. And so basically increasing their influence. This is a little bit imperialistic at some level, but also Africa is a rapidly growing country and infrastructure is desperately needed. The thing is, it would be great if it was done in the form of foreign aid rather than building things that are still basically owned by the country that built them. All right, so with China, we see that the blue here represents their foreign aid, but the non-aid funding, so, you know, that I'm talking about, the building of infrastructure and ownership that China will maintain is huge in these areas. And I don't know why quite it peaked so much in 2010 here. The United States, as you can see, most of its money really is going into foreign aid, relatively speaking. Okay, so to end today's lecture and then to end this module on the sea race and the implications of it going forward, I definitely need you to watch those 4 supplementary videos that I put on Canvas: the colonialism, the short version of World War I, the short version of World War II, and then the decolonialism, because it really brings you to up to date. It really will help you understand the distributions that you saw on the maps in these lectures, okay, or in this particular lecture. But again, what I'm trying to say about this whole series of the sea race is that you have this propensity of humanity to go out and exploit, and that perhaps that age needs to stop, that we need to go forward in a new direction. As I say, put the brakes on the train. Now, I would liken the early 1600s after the sea race to be analogous to where we are in the space race. Okay, you had that initial flurry of the sea race, and then in the 1600s, we developed the VOC and the East India Company and the total exploitation that you're going to also see in these videos that are supplementary. And that caused this imbalance on the planet that we see today. Even something relatively new like the development of the infrastructure of the World Wide Web, the internet, is completely an imprint map of that outcome of that imperialistic and colonialistic era. We are at sort of the equivalent in the space race. We're sort of in the equivalent of the pre-colonial, pre-imperialistic era. The question is, are we going to go out there and and do land grabs, do planet grabs, do asteroid grabs. And in that way, is there going to be an infrastructure built up, and we can call it geographically, but solar system graphically, if there's a word for that, as far as where religions will be, will there be certain religions in the asteroid belt and different religions on Mars, languages, freedom of expression, slavery, all of these things that humanity's done. Are we going to continue to do those? Or are we going to pause and figure out how to go out into space and a completely new paradigm of expansion? That one that is much more unified, one that might be in tune with Frank White's Cosma hypothesis, not asking what can the universe give us, but what can we give back to the universe as we work as one with it and see ourselves that way. So I just want to read my box at the bottom here in yellow. We are pushing the resources on Earth to their limits. Whenever we are placed in that situation, we exploit new resources. That is history. It's in the books already. It is not our pattern to tighten our collective belts and be more efficient, but to brazenly expand into open territories and take what we need from them. Will we simply continue the current arc of human growth and expansion and take it off planet? Or will we apply wisdom and restraint and create a new version of the human condition as we settle the solar system? Now, what I'm saying is that the pen of history has been passed to you. And now I hope that this module has helped you understand where that pen of history has been and the momentum for the future that is sitting in that pen, in the direction of that momentum. And the question is, as your generation, for the next 50, maybe 60 years, puts that pen to paper and writes human history and sets the direction of the course of human history, what are you going to do with that pen? It's in your hands. And so I'm hoping that this discussion of this perspective has helped you understand a little bit about where you sit on the arc of the human story as we, in the most exciting terms, you live in an amazing period. We are going to breach a new physical frontier in ways that are analogous to the sea race, where humanity's concept of its planet, in our case, our concept of the solar system, and who we are, how we fit into it, is completely upended and revolutionized. What are we going to do with that? And last, I'd just like to ask you about the US Space Force. In your mind, do you think it was a prudent and necessary step for Trump to have developed a Space Force? You know, do you want to take the military out into space? Do you want to say, hey, we are going to protect the orbital space of the moon to make sure that nobody else has control over it, that we can maintain our influence there? Or is this something that we don't want to take a set a precedent for so that other nations then have space forces and then we end up taking our military up into space? So next time we get together, we are going to start talking about science fiction and the rocket and the post-World War II development of the rocket and the development of the Cold War. Like I said, bombs and missiles together, changing the world, and then moving us to the point where, hey, let's put a human on a rocket and let's put them on the moon. And that's how we're going to try to take this out of the military hands. So there is an individual, John F. Kennedy, who did something to change that course and diffuse it and make it something better. That's what I'm telling you guys. Make that so. Do that. Okay. I will see you next time for the next module, and I hope you enjoyed the sea race part of this class.